y'all? Shout out to the LDBC. It's your boy Fight Critic, and here to give you guys a Sunday drop, just to give you guys just a long form, recording of just things that I've just been covering over, stuff with boxing. I'm gonna actually spend most of this video talking about Dillian Whyte, its victory over Alexander Povetkin. But first and foremost, I haven't been able to post as much as I would like to in the last couple of weeks, mostly because I've been having to do a lot of stuff when it comes to work, especially with like going through a new period of renegotiating a bunch of things in terms of salary, benefits, stuff like that. So when that happens, I usually have to take my mind off of a ton of things and put my level of attention into those things. So that's one of the big reasons why I haven't been able to post. But I still have managed to keep up with everything. So like I got a chance to look at the Canelo fight, you know, that kind of win as expected. Um, got a chance to look at Estrada versus Chocolatito, the rematch. I thought that was a bit of a job that was pulled off on Roman Gonzalez. I thought he won the fight. I think I scored it 8-4 for Roman Gonzalez. So I'll have to go back and take a look at it. I know I got a couple of videos that I have been promising for quite some time that I haven't been able to touch on, so I'm willing to put them in more of a long form discussion in order for me to put out the content and the information. But first and foremost, uh, I did want to kind of discuss what's been going on and kind of set some boundaries for myself. Um, so as you know, I'm part of the LDBC. And yes, I'm quite aware that as much of the crowd that we get in terms of people who positively interact with us, I'm also aware of also the negative backlash. And that just comes with the nature of the game. I'm not in this business to satisfy everybody. I'm not in this business to make everybody happy with my statements and my videos. So if you don't like my videos, if you feel like what you're hearing doesn't suit what you like, then tough cookie. Just go somewhere where you can feel appreciated in your content. But as long as I am here and I am doing what I want to do, and regardless of my subscriber count, I'm going to put out a message that I feel is authentic and real to me. And one of the big reasons why I'm part of this community is because back in the day, we all didn't know what we wanted to accomplish in terms of putting out content. And then we sort of realized that, much like it is in the world, a lot of people tend to be very, very upset when they see a lot of Black individuals start to honestly hold each other accountable, hold each other accountable. And then they take things a step further and they start to mobilize and actually put their message out there. So I don't think people hate us because of what we say and what we do, but I think they hate us because we're able to do this. Because you see a bunch of bullshit that happens in the sport, and a lot of people turn their eye to it, whether you like it or not. But when certain people actually go out there and they put that message out there, they get really, really upset, especially when it comes to a specific group of people. And this has nothing to do with me playing some sort of race card or anything like that. No, this is just how history has often defined people of different colors. You see people who have the loudest voice in the room, and they often aren't Black people. But when a Black person does have the loudest voice in the room, it tends to be seen as provocative and it tends to be seen in negative lighting, as opposed to people actually sitting down and actually like thinking things through and actually asking the right questions and having an honest discussion. So as long as I'm able to put out, content on my platform and I'm happy about it, and I feel like what I'm doing is real and true to me, and I haven't, violated my demeanor and values as a person and as a boxing fan, then you're just gonna have to deal with it. But if that's something that you don't like to do, then that's on you. I spend a lot of time, listening to content that other people put out that don't necessarily subscribe to my views. Why? Because it's important to actually hear, what's the other side of the coin. And you'll notice that 80% of the time, a lot of it is illogical, and 20% of the time, you actually find somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. But you don't often, have the instance where you're like almost like intrigued, or like you find yourself like, oh my God, like this person gave me a different perspective. But the times that they are, I appreciate those opinions. So I thought I'd just put that message out there. Um, But also, I think you guys also just don't like us because you don't like us. But also, I did also want to talk about a lot of the recent news that's been coming out because I do a lot of videos talking about, um, Joshua Fury, Deontay Wilder, and just like the prominent heavyweights. Mostly because it brings you a lot of really good traction, which is the most part. And I think also when you think about it, uh, the focal point in this year in boxing is on two different divisions. It's on the welterweight division with Errol Spence and Terrence Crawford, and it's on the heavyweight division with Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury. And to some extent, you also have Deontay Wilder. And over the last couple of weeks, we've heard a lot of conflicting news about, Joshua and Fury. Is it going to happen? If it's not going to happen, I am making the decision myself to step out of this discussion for the time being. Why? Because every time something positive happens, there's always something negative that follows it. And not in a sense of like people, like fans having like positive or negative backlash, but every time something positive comes out on the side of this is getting closer to being a fight, you hear something negative from the same group of people, and by people I mean promoters. So when Eddie Hearn goes out of his way to say, "Oh yeah, no, the fight's official," and you have both Frank Warren and you have Tyson Fury and to some extent Bob Arum saying, "Yo, time the fuck out. We never wanted to be in a situation where we were gonna let you say this." That to me shows that there is a level of business ethics that are not being held on both sides. Now, I get Eddie Hearn's, wanting to make this fight official because he has promised for what seems to be months that this fight was going to be announced. And for many times that he gets asked about this in these interviews, he keeps pushing the goalpost on when the fight is going to be announced. And I think for him, he probably just got agitated and annoyed. And he's just like, yo, we've signed the terms and agreements. We should just push this fight out there. And on the other side, you've got Frank Warren, Tyson Fury, and Bob Arum. And they're just like, no, this fight isn't technically official. Like, yes, we've agreed to terms. We know what we're getting ourselves into, but we haven't fully agreed that this fight is going to happen 100%. And for me, I'm not going to take a side in this little like, back and forth. I'm just going to let everything play out how it's going to play out. But one of the big things that I did note, and what kind of, alluded back to what I was saying before when it comes to just Wilder and, the situation is I don't think this fight is going to take place in America, which I think was something that Aram probably wanted to do. But the fact that there's still an ongoing arbitration process between Wilder and Fury for the third fight. And I just got to be candid, guys. If Wilder and Fury were going through arbitration to figure out money, this would have been decided a long time ago. It doesn't take over a year for people to get something this sorted out if it's just about money. And I think the reality of the situation is there's some sort of responsibility that is still on Tyson Fury to fulfill that third fight because you wouldn't see this get dragged out this long. We've seen mediation periods get solved in a month. We've seen arbitration get solved in a month to 2 months at times. Arbitration is something that baseball players go through who are, so for example, when it comes to arbitration, when a baseball player is on his rookie contract, he's under that contract for 6 years. There's no dollar amount to it most of the times, but he's on that contract for 6 years. Once he's played 3 full seasons in the league, he has the opportunity to see what type of yearly contract that his team is going to pay him. And if he doesn't like that number, he can reject that number and wait for them to give him a number that he feels that is represented by either his production or the market value of what his position is in his production. And many times you may see teams meet that number, but sometimes you see them go to arbitration to figure it out. And usually they have to figure this out a month before spring training starts. And in some situations, they also go into spring training at times and they have to figure this out. But you never see this kind of drag on into the season. Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder seem to be in arbitration since November. It's almost summertime, and this still hasn't been resolved. So if you're thinking logically about this, it shouldn't take this long for the process to get figured out. So when I look at the fact that it's taking this long, you have both sides who are saying inconsistent things. it tells me that yes, there might be some obligation that Tyson Fury has to fulfill this third fight. Now, if this fight happens before Joshua and Fury, that's where a lot of that stuff is confusing to me because I ultimately believe that if Wilder wins this case that he's dealing with, and if this case was about money, it would have been solved a long time ago. But if it's not about money and it's about him fulfilling this contract, then I ultimately believe that Tyson Fury more than likely will not be able to fight in the United States in his next fight unless it is Deontay Wilder. Because if Wilder does win his arbitrary case, and they say that Tyson Fury has to fulfill this third fight, then every single boxing commission has to honor the boxing commission in which that fight took place. And if the California State Athletic Commission in the Nevada State Athletic, actually, it's the Nevada State Athletic Commission. Forgot the rematch happened in Vegas. My apologies. But if the Nevada State Athletic Commission says, yes, we are honoring and upholding the law here, then every single boxing commission has to do the same when it comes to this type of legal matter. That's why whenever a guy tests positive with a state and he can't fight, you would just think, oh, he just goes to another state and takes a fight. But no, that's not the case. The case is what happens is that that boxing commission makes a ruling, and every other boxing commission in the country has to honor that ruling. And that's why Arum had hinted out them fighting outside the U.S. But the biggest issues that they have is this COVID situation. And for them, it looks like they're trying to get this fight, signed and a go-to for Saudi Arabia. Now, while there may be a lot of moral issues with putting the fight in Saudi Arabia, I'm not the kind of person who is going to act like I am above and beyond this situation. I'm not the most upstanding person 100% of the time. I'm not going to sit there and say that I've never made a mistake or I've never agreed with somebody who ultimately, in the public's view, is a bad person. But here's what I could say about this situation if it goes to Saudi Arabia. If it does go to Saudi Arabia, then there's one thing that I have to point out that the video that I made about those guys making all that money, if it's not possible, I'm definitely going to be super wrong about it because of the amount of money that those guys are probably going to pay for. But secondly, if this fight does go to Saudi Arabia, I think this fight puts a ton of pressure on boxing fans from the UK. And the reason why is you guys are going to have to come to the reality that this fight not taking place in the UK and taking place in Saudi Arabia is a massive spit in the face to you guys. And I know for a lot of you guys, you want these guys to be able to make the most amount of money and to be in the best situations because boxing is a very cruel sport. And trust me, I completely understand that. I just want you guys to be aware that they are making this fight for the people who have an enormous amount of endowment. And if it's your perspective that this fight is for the fans, this is the biggest fight in the heavyweight division, and if it's two British people, you would logically think that this fight would actually go to the UK and it would be in the best situation for you guys to be part of this event. But when this fight takes place in Saudi Arabia, it's the promoters saying that you guys don't really matter. And this is a fight so that we can make the most amount of money. And it also means that you guys are probably going to pay a lot of money, more than what you would ever consider paying for, in order just to be able to watch this fight. And if it means attending this fight, it's almost going to be way more money than even if what you would have done coming to America to actually watch a fight of this magnitude. So I want you guys to think really, really like deep about that. And, I want you guys to actually be proactive in wanting that fight in the UK. Though it won't make the guys the amount of money that they're looking for, but if you feel like this fight is for you, it's for the fans, and it should be where both guys are from, then you guys need to be as vocal as possible. Because I know one thing. If it's one thing about promoters, if you give them even the slightest opportunity to take advantage of the fans, they're going to do it every time. And they've always been doing this. So it is what it is, and I hope ultimately at the end of the day, if this fight does get officially announced and both guys have agreed, and we know we have a venue in X, Y, and Z, and if it does take place in the UK, I will give a massive applaud to the UK fans for making that happen. But if it happens in Saudi Arabia, I'm gonna also have to give you guys a lot of fucking heat. So that's my thoughts on Joshua versus Fury. I'm not gonna make any real videos kind of talking about things that is developed because ultimately it gets very, very tiring. And I think that at the end of the day, if both these guys, if both these guys are gonna fight each other, I'd much rather just wait for them both to be in the ring, and I'd much rather treat this like Mayweather versus Pacquiao. But yeah, that's how I feel about that. I don't really have much to say around Canelo Alvarez's win against Anvil Yildirim, other than that I expected it. And there's not really much of anything else that's been going on in the sport, to be honest. I will say that I like the idea of David Benavidez versus Jamal Charlo. I think that's a great fight for Charlo to take. Just because I don't think he's going to get any of the major players in the middleweight division. If he was going to get them, we would have seen it by now. So I think for Charlo, he should be doing everything in his power to put himself on that pound for pound list, put himself in an opportunity to keep being able to provide for his family and his community, and take on difficult challenges. I don't think he's going to be given those options at middleweight, and I know he doesn't want to sign any sort of deal that like holds him accountable to any other promoter. I think he likes his situation right now, and that's just always going to be the case with certain guys at PBC. Some of those guys end up signing deals with those other promoters. A lot of those guys don't because they like where they're at. They like to be able to control all these things. They like to be able to make more money and more avenues on their events rather than signing with a promoter. So I think that's going to be the case. And for Deontay Wilder, I know there's been rumored a couple of fights that he may take in the event that Joshua versus Fury takes out place outside the U.S., which would ultimately it would put a huge dent in his plans should he win his arbitration case right now to get Tyson Fury to commit to the contract that they signed. And there's been a couple of floated names like, Charles Martin. And I think for any fighter right now, outside of maybe Canelo, I don't really care much about what fights they're taking because I already know that this environment that people have been fighting in is very, very new and different to them. And for a lot of guys have a lot of ring rust. I give a lot of, praise to both, guys like Spence and guys like Canelo for not only just staying active, but also trying to make sure that they're fighting competitive fights outside of Anvil Yildirim. But you saw a guy like Errol Spence who came back from a devastating injury to actually come back and take on a high level opponent like Danny Garcia, in my opinion, was great. I do not like the idea of Danny Garcia moving up to junior middleweight. Danny Garcia is a 5'8" welterweight who balloons up to about 170, 180 pounds and he cuts down to weight. I don't like the idea of him stepping into fighting junior middleweights that are roughly 5'11" to 6'1" at times, who, balloon up 20 pounds heavier than him and cut down weight. Guys who are younger, faster, stronger than him that have the opportunity to really test his chin in a way that we haven't seen since Lucas Matisse and, of course, Keith Thurman. I don't like that idea for Danny Garcia at all. I think Danny Garcia should be doing a lot of what Zab Judah did late in his career, which was either try to stay at the weight that you're at or try to better condition yourself to move down in weight. I'm not saying that Danny Garcia is too big for junior welterweight, but I think with him, I think if he were to take a look at better ways to stay in shape year round, based off of what we've seen so far, I think he could get back down to the 140 weight class. If not, just stay at 147, better condition yourself, and just try to be a guy who takes a ton of fights there. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think moving up in weight, thinking that you're going to feel comfortable because, the way that you've been training, you want to stick to it, it's just not feasible as time goes on, especially when you look at the body and how it like continues to do things. So I think for Danny Garcia, I don't think it's the right move for him to make. But it is what it is. That's what guys do. That's what they want to do. And a lot of times we often see guys move up to a weight class and they like I feel stronger. I feel great, and then they get beaten up really bad or knocked out, and they just said like the weight was a little bit too much for them. It's a bit of a hypocritical situation, and I don't ever like seeing fighters in that because ultimately that's your health. So it is what it is. Now, we had a couple fights over the last weekend with Virgil Ortiz and Maurice Hooker. It was a great fight by Virgil Ortiz, and I've started to pay more attention to Ortiz's career. I think he's the only real thing left outside of Ryan Garcia that Oscar De La Hoya is clinging to. But I think I like Virgil Ortiz's game. I think he'll be definitely a big game player for the welterweight division. I don't think he's that quite there yet, personally. But I think in the long run, I can see him either being a champion or challenging for a title. but I still think he's about a year and a half out. Um, and of course, we got the big fight yesterday, and this fight was just I have no side in this fight. Dillian Whyte, of course, to me is a very controversial figure, I would have to say. And the reason why I say Dillian Whyte's a controversial figure is because 99% of the bad things that has happened to Dillian Whyte has ultimately been his fault. And a lot of people like to make a ton of excuses for him. And I don't understand why. He spent so much time as the mandatory challenger for the WBC title, despite the fact that he ultimately wasn't the mandatory challenger for a long time. In fact, he was just the number one contender while other guys were getting mandatory shots. Now, why is that the case? Because at a time where Dillian Whyte was actually competing to be the number one ranked guy in the division, there were other guys who were fighting higher ranked opponents on the WBC to become the mandatory challenger. And that's oddly enough what happened with the Dominic Brazil situation. There was a point in time where Dillian Whyte and Dominic Brazil each fought a guy. And Dillian Whyte, the guy that he fought, made him the number one contender. But for Dominic Brazil, the guy that he fought made him a mandatory challenger. And people just weren't putting two and two together. They felt because Dillian Whyte was number one ranked, he should get a direct title shot. But each and every time, people had to be reminded that Dominic Brazil beat a guy that made him mandatory challenger. And for many people, they just couldn't understand it. They were baffled by it and they were upset. And yeah, you can definitely be upset about it because Dominic Brazil, in my opinion, was nothing special. He was just a guy who had been, toyed around with by Anthony Joshua. How could he end up being a mandatory challenger? But also at the same time, you could have said very similar to Dillian Whyte. Dillian Whyte, every time he was presented with a big opportunity, he did not look like the Dillian Whyte that a lot of us kind of saw in these random fights that he took. And when presented with, bigger challenges that would have given us a surefire thing about it, whether it is fighting Luis Ortiz or challenging Brazil for the mandatory shot, he was fighting Derek Chisora. Like, let's just be honest about it. So for many of us, we're looking at, not only just the resume, but the type of opponent that he wanted to fight. And this was at a time where Luis Ortiz, many people who felt like he was going to beat Deontay Wilder. And let's just be honest about it. There were a lot of people who felt that Deontay Wilder would want absolutely nothing to do with Luis Ortiz. And Wilder went in and he beat Luis Ortiz on two occasions. And for many people, they're still kind of surprised by that. But for Dillian Whyte, he wasn't fighting the kind of guys that I felt that was important. And then he has the Oscar Rivas fight. And like that was like the first fight where I was just like, yes, maybe I can finally get behind Dillian Whyte in this fight. And seeing that fight, much like the Derek Chisora fight, Whyte usually starts off great and then he like just takes a massive fade, as the fight goes on. And he ends up putting himself in a situation where, he gets hurt, he gets dropped, and all of a sudden I'm thinking to myself, this could never happen in a fight versus Deontay Wilder. You could never be in a situation where late in the fight you're fading and Wilder puts you down. Because if there's one thing about Wilder is as crazy and as wild as his style is, if Wilder has the opportunity to get you out of there, he is going to absolutely throw caution to the wind and try to do it. And for the majority of the time, he's been successful at it. But for Dillian Whyte, it was rough kind of seeing the fact that how could you start a fight out so great and then fade? And ultimately, it led me to realize that if Dillian Whyte's not getting a guy out of there in less than 8 rounds, then he's got a little bit of a Mir Khan in him. Not to say that he has the same type of chin, but he just he does a bad time. He has a bad time at finishing fights as well as he starts fights. And there's nothing wrong with that. There have been tons of fighters who have done horrible in the second half of the fight versus the first half. A really good example about that is Oscar De La Hoya. Oscar De La Hoya was absolutely lightning fast in the first 6 rounds of every high level fight that he fought. But after round six, Oscar De La Hoya slows down. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. It's just the nature of the fight. It's just how a guy is. It's just how his body responds. And I don't think Dillian Whyte is ever going to be the type of person that can fix that, which is why it's led, in my opinion, to the two situations in which he's tested positive for performance enhancing drugs or, a well known steroid. Now, The Oscar Rivas fight, leaving that situation and finding about his drug test and finding about, the situation that was going on with the gloves, to me, it killed a lot of perspective that I had. I'm just going to be honest. And going into the Povetkin fight, the first time, I really didn't care much for it because I don't give a shit about Alexander Povetkin either. Alexander Povetkin has been a guy who has shown that he is afraid of fighting a fight in which he is not either seen as the victor, or it's a situation in which like he will try to drag the fight out as long as possible. And I know for many new age boxing fans, you're kind of just like, really? Like, when was this? Dude, Alexander Povetkin delayed the Vladimir Klitschko fight what seemed to be forever when they fought. And this happened, a long time ago, where Povetkin was just delaying his mandatory shot, delaying his mandatory shot. He was the regular WBA champion, and he just kept delaying his title shot. He was taking step aside money. He was doing it so much, and then he wanted to put himself in a position to where Vlad had to step out of Germany, go to Russia, and fight him. And they paid Klitschko, I think, something like $15 million to do it because they went to a purse bid. And then Klitschko absolutely dominated him over 12 rounds. And then you saw the same thing with Deontay Wilder. They were scheduled to fight in the fall of 2015. Yeah, they were scheduled to fight that fall. What ends up happening? The WBC puts an October deadline for them to actually start negotiating for a fight in the winter. Wilder goes to the WBC and says, "Hey, I know there's an October deadline. Can I take a fight in September?" So what does Wilder do? He takes a fight in September, wins that fight to defend his title so that he can stay active because he hadn't had a fight since January, I believe. Um, or was it? I think he fought in the springtime and then he fought in. Yeah, I think he fought in the springtime and then he fought in September. So he took a voluntary, then he fought in September, so that he could fight 3 times a year. Povetkin, around that same time, he schedules a fight in November after they're supposed to negotiate. So the WBC says, "All right, cool, we'll push negotiations to December," and Wilder, being Wilder, he's like, "Cool, we'll start negotiating in December." Povetkin goes all the way to the WBC convention in December and asks them to delay the fight because he feels that he's not ready to negotiate because of the fight that he just fought. Despite the fact that Wilder also has same amount of wear and tear on his body, it's like, yo, I'm ready for this fight. But Povetkin chooses not to. So they end up delaying this negotiation process to January, and then it goes to the purse bid. And of course, it's going to be hard to outbid, Alexander Povetkin's side. So what ends up happening is Wilder, he ends up, losing the purse bid, but as a result, he ends up getting a large percentage of the purse bid being champion. I think it was something like 70-30. And Povetkin side, they're like, cool. They put, the majority of the money in escrow, and then the weekend like leading up the week before the fight, or even the weekend before the fight, Wilder's already been training in England for a couple weeks, and he's getting ready to get on a flight to go to Russia, which is very, very smart, because flying from the U.S. to Russia is a very long flight. Flying just to from the U.S. all the way to London is it's sometimes a 5 to 7 hour flight, depending on like where you're coming and going from. To just fly to your Russia was probably just another 3 4 hours. So if I was him, yeah, I wouldn't enjoy taking that long flight the week of a fight to then try to acclimate yourself. So he went to Europe. Um, Trained in Europe, and then he was going to get ready to take a flight over to Russia when the news broke about Povetkin testing positive for clenbuterol. So Povetkin's A sample comes back and it's dirty. His B sample comes back and it's dirty. And they stay in a arbitration period, which actually ends on time. But in that time, Povetkin has to serve a retroactive suspension, and Wilder just goes on to voluntary, take his fights. And then Povetkin then tests positive again, leading into the Bermane-Stavern fight. So you have two guys who are multiple, you know, violators of, the things that we hold really important to us. And something that I've always said about, guys who test positive. Look, if a fighter wants to fight a guy be like after he tests positive, that's his business. I don't care about that. But when fans go out of their way to defend guys who take PEDs and they take drugs, and these are things that are clearly banned, then I don't know what to tell you. You're representing somebody who is knowingly trying to get a competitive edge to shorten the lifespan of another fighter. It's not like we're looking at baseball here, where I think steroids in baseball is actually okay, because you're not actually physically hurting somebody unless you see data that shows that pitchers are bound to hit batters a lot more often in the steroid era. But a lot of those guys, they're prescribed steroids or they're given steroids not only to just heal their bodies, because baseball is one of those weird sports where you don't stay warmed up all the time, so it's very frequent that you could get hurt. But also, a lot of them use it to gain a competitive edge. They want to get stronger. They want to be able to get faster. They want to be able to hit the ball harder. They want to be able to throw the ball harder. But in boxing, this is something that's dangerous. This like guys have died in the ring. Guys have died, being hit really hard and going to the hospital. Guys are vegetables. Guys have had brain bleeds and their careers have been over. Guys have had some horrific sort of shit happen to them. So when you give, these guys the opportunity to take an even stronger competitive edge to do things like these to other fighters, yes, there's something morally wrong with it. And there's something morally wrong with you to defend these guys doing this shit. The amount of fucking people that defended Alexander Povetkin's PED use is it's just unbelievable, personally. And the amount of people who defended Dillian Whyte for taking Bol, which is one of the most abused steroids ever, is also indefensible, and it's also morally wrong. And I think those individuals are pieces of shit. That's ultimately how I feel about it. But when you look at, this type of fight, I had no stock in this fight because I'm looking at two guys who have abused PEDs fighting each other. And I can't really root for any guy. But I did thought it was funny that Dillian Whyte got knocked out in the first fight. And I did think it was pretty funny that Dillian Whyte knocked out Povetkin in the rematch. So ultimately, I felt happy regardless of who was going to win or lose this fight, because I don't really feel much for any of these guys. For Alexander Povetkin, it's time for your old ass to retire. You have been probably one of the most, I want to say this in the right way, for what you have done in terms of bullshitting us, like throughout the latter half of your career. I'm happy that you have not been able to sniff another opportunity in which you have become champion again. You don't deserve that, right? And for Dillian Whyte, this all boils down to one thing that I think that a lot of people need to pay attention to. There are a lot of other heavyweights in the division that I think Dillian Whyte can fight that would be a better opponent than Alexander Povetkin. Now, this is not to discredit Povetkin as an opponent, ultimately, because I think that Whyte versus Povetkin is a decent fight. Granted, it's not the fight that I want to see for Dillian Whyte. I thought Dillian Whyte would have had a better challenge fighting a guy like Michael Hunter, but before he headed to the first Povetkin fight. But now you still got a guy like Michael Hunter who's still, at that same sort of level as a Dillian Whyte in the heavyweight division. You've got, Usyk, who I think would be the most straightforward fight for Dillian Whyte to take. And then, of course, you got Joe Joyce, who has made himself a major player now in the division as a guy who started late. So there's a lot of guys that you could look to and you could say like, yo, like this isn't Joshua Fury Wilder and then Dillian Whyte. No, this is Joshua Fury Wilder, and then you got Whyte, Joyce, Usyk, Michael Hunter, and then you also got some other heavyweights that can also make a splash in the division. So I think for Dillian Whyte, I don't think the way that he was leaving the Chisora rematch and where he is now, I don't think he's progressed up further. I think he's just always been at the same type of level until he takes an opponent where you're just like, yep, that's gonna be the fight, in my opinion, that if Dillian Whyte wins, that pushes him over into the edge. But that's ultimately how I feel. That's always been the case. Whenever I've watched other heavyweights in the past, I think as a very good example, like I was not completely sold on Deontay Wilder when he was going into his first title fight versus Bermane Stiverne. And it has nothing to do with the fact that Bermane Stiverne and I are Haitian. It just has to do with the fact that Bermane Stiverne spent a long time beating up Chris Arreola, who was on the cusp of getting another title shot. And he beat him very convincingly. And it was done in a way that I was just like, okay, Bermane Stiverne has a legit shot at trying to solidify himself as a champion. And I had no real expectations of what Wilder was going to do, and then Wilder exceeded my expectations. It's very similar to Gervonta Davis. I didn't think Gervonta Davis was going to actually do well versus Jose Pedraza, and he absolutely checked off everything off the box. And I just haven't seen it with Dillian Whyte yet. And I think if he fights a guy like Usyk, or he fights a guy like Joe Joyce, or a Michael Hunter, I think he starts to check those boxes. And there's nothing wrong with me doing that because I'm holding him to a level of standard that I hold for every other fighter in the sport. Same thing with Anthony Joshua. Going into his first title fight, I didn't feel like Joshua was going was there for me to be like, oh yeah, 110% he can do it. But he checked off a lot of boxes. The Klitschko fight, very same situation. He checked off the remainder of the boxes. Like, granted, he did take a little bit of a step back with the Ruiz fights, and seeing his title defenses and him showing, signs of different sort of technical weaknesses. But ultimately, Joshua has checked off every box that I have expected of him. And Wilder has done the same. Fury has done the same. And Usyk hasn't quite done it just yet at heavyweight. And the same with Joyce and same with Hunter. And they're all in the same group with Dillian Whyte. So I think that's where his mind needs to be at. And if it means that Dillian Whyte can get in the ring with Wilder next, look, I don't think Dillian Whyte can beat Deontay Wilder. And it has nothing to do with a bias that I have. I just look at the fact that Dillian Whyte has often had a very bad time avoiding the shot. And you know what I mean by the shot. And if there's one thing about Deontay Wilder, he has a very good chance of landing the shot. And I think, much like what a lot of people expect this fight to go, if Dillian Whyte is not able to do a similar performance on Deontay Wilder that Tyson Fury did in the rematch, then I think Deontay Wilder is just going to spend his time trying to line him up for the right hand. And I ultimately think that that's going to be what kind of does Dillian Whyte in. But that's ultimately how I feel about this sort of situation. Now, I think what he did yesterday was a very good way for him to get revenge, because he got knocked out brutally in that first fight, and he managed to get Povetkin out of there, I think, in 4 rounds. And he looked pretty good doing it. He looked like he knew what he needed to make the mistake of. And in the first fight, he made the mistake of getting comfortable and thinking that he was just going to be able to find the opportunity to get Povetkin out of there later. And Povetkin snuck one up on him. He snuck the shot on him. But for Dillian Whyte, he wasn't going to give Povetkin the opportunity to get the shot. He was just like, if I'm going to, I'm going to get him out of the ring as soon as possible. And he did that. And that's something that, makes things exciting for people. But I think the next step for Dillian Whyte is, number one, he needs to be able to continue to stay clean, because regardless of what a lot of people want to say, and regardless of what people feel in terms of drug cheats in the sport of boxing, I think once a guy has tested positive once, there's a little bit of okay, shit happens. But once a guy tests positive twice, I'm like, yeah, there's always going to be that hanging cloud over you. So he needs to be able to not only stay clean going into his future fights, but he also needs to be able to realize that a lot of the situations that he's put him in are his fault. And the minute that he takes responsibility and understands that, there are guys in the division that I can start putting on my resume more and more and more and get them out of the way, I think there's not going to be a reason for me to be screaming out that I deserve a title shot. And that's the one thing that, unless there's blatant this is a blatant situation in which I feel like Deontay Wilder, or Tyson Fury, or Anthony Joshua, or Dillian Whyte, or any of these other guys are being specifically targeted, then most of the time they're a product of their own environment, and the same with Dillian Whyte. So I think ultimately at the end of the day, Dillian Whyte's gonna have to be able to show that he does not need to be able to vindicate his position in the end. But this was a decent fight. It's not necessarily the type of fight that I was like setting aside every part of my day to go watch. But it was ultimately a fight that I managed to catch a little bit later on in the day. Just go back and watch it on a stream that wasn't taken down, and he looked good for the most part. So kudos to him. I would love to see him try to get in the ring next with a Michael Hunter. With Usyk and Joy Joyce trying to figure out what they're going to do, because there's a lot of confusion hanging there because of Joshua versus Fury. But if his next fight is either Michael Hunter, I'll enjoy it, or one of those two guys. I don't think he's gonna be. I don't think this should be a situation where he should just jump directly to Wilder. I think he should take that fight first. But that's what I think about it. If you guys have any comments, please leave them down. If you agree with it, please comment. If you disagree with it, please comment. Just know that if you disagree with it and I think your opinion's stupid, I'm probably going to delete your comment anyway. But that's just because I hate stupid people and I hate people who do semantics. Um, and if you guys need more content like this, please make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe in total. And I'll more than likely drop another long form of these in the middle of next week.